like he was standing in front of the jury, just dropping by for a chat. And the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was equally well represented in the persons of the district attorney, Hosea Knowlton, who was from New Bedford and who would later succeed his own boss as Attorney General of Massachusetts, and also the district attorney, another district attorney named William Moody, who had an even more glittering career and ended his career on the Supreme Court of the United States. Whereas Knowlton was a kind of man out of a Teddy Roosevelt manual of manliness. He's described as extremely compact and wide, and snorts like a horse, and one of the journalists referred to him as horsey. Moody, by contrast, was a young, blonde, blue-eyed, and it was said dressed like a New Yorker, which presumably was a sign of great sophistication. So the stage was sort of set for the spectacle that was going to rivet the nation. Reporters flocked to the scene, and I'll just read a bit about what some of the newspapers said. The trial of Lizzie Borden, according to the Providence Journal, would be one of the greatest murder trials in the world's history. The New York World more modestly declared it the trial of the most extraordinary criminal case in the history of New England. The Boston Globe proclaimed, "It will be impossible to exaggerate the interest felt and manifested by intelligent readers throughout the country in the outcome of this trial of a comparatively young woman for the murder of her father and stepmother. The Boston Globe estimated that among its own readership, there are at this moment 100,000 persons devoting what they are pleased to call their minds in a hopeless analysis of this tremendous case. To satisfy this demand, so many correspondents and reporters converged on New Bedford that the New Bedford Evening Standard questioned whether a more distinguished collection of newspaper writers were ever detailed to cover a murder trial." It should be noted that the courthouse actually had to be reconfigured to accommodate all these different reporters, including a shed out in the back for all the wire services. And there were so many wire services that one journalist noted that you could hang all the washings of Bristol County on them. Some examples of the journalists, and they provided a lot of the kind of color commentaries, sort of background to make the trial more vivid. At least that's how I found it. One of them was a man named Joe Howard Jr., who was the highest paid columnist in his day, and he covered the trial for the Boston Globe. And just to give you a little bit of a sense of what he was like, there would be cartoonists who would illustrate him. He was significant enough that he was himself, worthy of being treated as a celebrity. And when he wasn't talking about the actual trial, in sort of slow moments, he scanned the crowd for pretty faces. He complained about the ramshackle mill teams passing on the busy street. And with great relish, he reported on the mooings of the cow of the day, this cow that was across the street, who would often seem to moo at particularly opportune times. For example, when a hair on a hatchet was identified as being perhaps bovine in origin. An editorial in the Globe opined that Joe Howard's cow would go down in history alongside Mrs. O'Leary's, the cow that was said to have started the Chicago fire. So, you might think that given what was at stake, it would be hard to find a jury, and surprisingly, that went rather smoothly. Prospective jurors from Fall River were excluded from the pool, and the jurors were mostly farmers. All but one were Protestants, also fathers. Noticeably absent, probably to the modern eye, were any women. Women didn't serve on Massachusetts juries until 1951. But to the to the journalists who were assembled and were viewing it as a kind of theater, they noted that there were women in the audience who constituted a sort of second jury. One journalist called them the Valentines and the Daisies, and they were about a third of the audience for most days. Another noticed that calico mixed with silk, which was a way of saying that all social classes were represented. The prosecution laid out a very damning circumstantial case. Lizzie Borden seemed to be the only person with any motive, certainly the only person with any motive for killing Mrs. Borden. And she seemed to have the best opportunity to commit the murder. She was alone, unaccounted for in the house, for parts of the critical period. The defense never really, offered a clear alternative to the prosecution theory. But, as Governor Robertson observed, it wasn't their job to clear up the mystery. The lawyers questioned whether or not a woman could physically have committed such brutal murders. It should be said that the medical experts all said that, a woman of ordinary strength could have swung a hatchet or some other kind of implement with sufficient force. But they were very adept at making this somehow seem implausible. They also summoned witnesses who had seen strange, odd men in the vicinity. My personal favorite is Dr. Handy's wild-eyed young man, who may or may not have been Mike the soldier, but was someone who was a known local who had an alcohol problem and was often lurking in the vicinity. But the idea was that it was possible that someone else had gotten in. The defense also very cleverly emphasized missteps in the police investigation to suggest that this was some sort of an orchestrated conspiracy, almost like a masculine, nefarious conspiracy to pin the murders on their defenseless female clients. The police witnesses had conveniently contradicted each other about the discovery of the possible murder weapon, which was a handleless hatchet that had been found in the basement. But their greatest success was really in keeping the best evidence of Lizzie Borden's guilt away from the jury. They won rulings excluding her inquest testimony, which memorialized the shifting stories that I mentioned first. Provided ample evidence of the household discord. And they also were able to keep out evidence of her alleged attempt to buy poison the day before the murders. Evidence in the prosecution's view of murderous intent that would have punctured the defense contention that Lizzie Borden was just this innocent bystander, simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I would argue, and this is the part that I think had me most interested when I think about studying the case myself, is the way in which the figure of Lizzie Borden, this kind of enigmatic figure, becomes someone onto whom people project different and totally opposing views. I mean, on the surface, she seemed to present the best possible argument in her own defense. She was active in good works, especially in her church, so she ticks all the boxes of respectable middle-class femininity. Some people saw something sort of sinister in her self-possession. A hostile local newspaper referred to her as the Sphinx of coolness. Most journalists considered her controlled demeanor a sign of ladylike bearing, a kind of inborn dignity that all but proved her innocence. One of the journalists referred to it as the grit of American womanhood. Lizzie Borden's lawyer, Andrew Jennings, actually compared the two women who were known to have been at the house at the time. So Lizzie Borden, the daughter, and Bridget Sullivan, the Irish domestic. And he said, which is the natural party to be suspected? The stranger, he might as well have said, in a way that has some contemporary echoes, the immigrant, or the youngest daughter. And at his words, Lizzie Borden wept, as she had done in other moments of pathos in the trial. She often hid her head beneath her fan during some of the prosecution's most gruesome medical testimony, and she fainted when the victim's skulls were produced in court. And all of this counted in her favor. One of the journalists interestingly noted that although she hid her fan when the prosecution was making points that were unfavorable to her and seemed to showcase the violence of the acts, she paid rapt attention when it was her own team making a point, and the journalist was sort of right on the edge of basically saying, well, that means that this is somehow feigned. But instead he said, well, women are just like that, basically. That the differing reactions depending on who was talking seemed to be part of the performance of femininity as well. So the defense really just asked the jury if it could believe that such a woman, this sort of seemingly kind of normal-looking woman, could have killed her father, and deprived of its best evidence of premeditation, the evidence that didn't come in at the trial. The prosecution really could only argue that she had been magically transformed into a murderess, evoking Dr. Jekyll's metamorphosis into the evil Mr. Hyde. And I also, when I'm giving these talks, I often wonder, should I reveal what happens? Because it's often the moment of suspense, and I don't want to spoil it. But again, I think in this crowd, there's probably no point in withholding the verdict. So, on the last day of the trial, the fervor to get in from interested citizens was even greater. The police had to erect a special barrier at the outset and deposed additional guards to keep the public at bay. And people were often, would often bring a lunch, and picnic in the neighborhood, to the degree that some of the local residents would put up special signs saying, "Keep off the steps." But in any event, all of the ordinary precautions were totally inadequate. About an hour before the opening, there was a big rush on the doors, and the audience flowed out into the anterooms and the stairways and the halls. So after this unusually long public trial, the jurors found that they were unanimous on the first ballot, but they withheld their verdict of not guilty for another hour and a half to appear reasonably deliberative. And so one of the questions that I'm interested in, and you may be as well, was whether or not this was is this reasonable doubt? Because there probably was reasonable doubt, or was this a more of an unreasonable certainty that a woman like Lizzie Borden simply could not have committed such crimes? So that brings me to the final question, the third question that I'm often asked, which is, so did she do it or not? As I said, non-spoiler alert, I don't take a position in the book. I thought it was important to lay out the story as fully as I could so that people could come to their own conclusions. But I'd say that where I end up is pretty much where one of the journalists did, at least at the outset, where he said that, as a practical matter, it's really very difficult to imagine how she could have committed both murders and presented herself, spotless between the two. At the same time, it seems pretty much impossible to me that anyone else could have done it, and managed to avoid the two women that we know were in the house at different points on the morning of the murders. So, I think what I would like to do is leave it there, and then have time for as many questions or comments as anyone would like to share. And I thank you very much for your attention. Okay. Hi.
I confess that I do
Whitmore published an article, or actually more than one, but it was after the trial. So, but very, there was a fair. Oh, I'm sorry. There was a fair amount of. I'm bad with microphones. There's a fair amount of discussion of that, at the time. But so this is still, say 1893, and the trial's June 1893. So it was later in that year. Oh well, thank you. I actually had. In the first draft, I had a lot more Wigmore because I'm really interested in him. And then one of my readers said, well, that's a nice little digression on Wigmore, but what does that have to do with Lizzie Borden? So I took it out. Anyway, hello.
Hi. I didn't know that they had not let in the inquest testimony. And on what basis did they make that judgment? And is that something that is still done today? Is that a precedent that was set back then?
Yeah, this is the question of why was the inquest testimony not let in? And essentially the argument was that she wanted to have her lawyer with her, and she wasn't formally told, she wasn't formally warned that she could, the equivalent of what we would think of as the kind of Miranda warnings. I mean, this is long before Miranda. We know what happened is that the police actually went to get her lawyer first to tell her she was going to be arrested. So I guess what I'm not answering this properly in that it seemed a little bit of a fig leaf for me. But it fit in well with this idea that the police and the prosecutors basically just had the inquest as a way to get information from her, and that this was a woman who was, unsettled by the death of her father and was given a prescription of morphine and was just in no condition. But I mean, as a formal legal matter, the grounds were that she should have been formally warned.
She should have had counsel at that inquest.
That's right. So that she was, that her defense lawyer, the more flamboyant one, Governor Robinson, says, denied counsel. If this is freedom, then God help the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And the fact that she's a woman, and the fact that there are, all these men around her, and particularly that the chief of police carried an unserved warrant in his pocket, so in other words, planned to arrest her, all counted as part of the atmosphere that suggested that really this was just a plot to extort testimony from her. Now, this is something that Wigmore, who was the leading authority on evidence in the country, thought was pretty preposterous, because he thought that she had consulted. We know she had consulted with her lawyer, even though he wasn't allowed to be present during the inquest, and so he must have told her that she didn't have specifically, I mean, for technical reasons, she didn't have what we would think of as Fifth Amendment rights, because that amendment wasn't incorporated to the states, but I mean, she had an equivalent under the Massachusetts Constitution, and
Would
so
you have been told that you don't have to answer any of their questions if you don't want to? And I suggest to you that you just don't answer them?
Well, that's the thing. The assumption Wigmore's making is that her lawyer must have talked to her about whether or not it made sense for her to participate or not. But when she was in the room, she was not in the room with her lawyer. She was in the room with the prosecutor, and without counsel. So the idea was that she was denied counsel. That's the legal basis on which it was denied. Yes.
How much money did Lizzie inherit, and what would that be equivalent to in today's dollars?
Yeah, so Mr. Borden's estate was fairly substantial. You know, around roughly a little under $500,000. So it would have been. I mean, I've heard various estimates, and I'm not sure that it's even. It doesn't. The translation is several million now, but it doesn't seem to me to capture what it would have been like to have that sort of money then. So I think you can say that she was. They were well off. I mean, they were extremely well off, but they weren't. It wasn't the kind of dizzying wealth that you're familiar with for some of the first families of Fall River, let alone the people who are not many miles away as the crow flies in Newport, or let alone New York. Yes?
Was the issue of her mental health brought up at the trial?
Not at the trial, though that was something that I found that the prosecution was really interested in, and they wanted her to be seen by a psychiatrist, you know, a doctor.
You know, rumors that she was.
Right. I think that's what the prosecution thought, and in fact, I found negotiation back and forth with the lawyers, but the defense felt fairly strongly that to even permit that to be discussed was to cast some doubt on her innocence, and their position was that she didn't do it.
Yeah.
Yes.
So if you were to go back in time and have the opportunity to be on the legal team as either prosecution or defense, which would you choose and why?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And believe it or not, I've actually never gotten that question.
It's truth or dare.
Yeah. I suppose I have to admit I'd be on the prosecution, which may reveal more than I intended to reveal. But that is also my background, so that's probably what I would have done. One of the things that struck me that is so interesting is that, you know, as a lawyer, the styles of the two sides and of the lawyers within the teams are so different, so that it's almost like they're talking, you know, kind of across each other. And it was fascinating to me to see, for example, the younger lawyer, Moody, handled most of these arguments on evidence that this question of whether or not the inquest testimony should be admitted, or the poison, or the alleged attempts to buy the poison. And he is just absolutely clear on the doctrine. You know, I mean, if he were a law student, that would be an A+ answer. You know, I read his arguments. And the defense lawyer's all over the place. You know, it doesn't seem like he has anything like the command of the precedents, or even their application in this case. But he's so good at weaving a story and giving the atmosphere that you can see why the judges would have been swayed. That for those of you who aren't lawyers, the calculus in deciding whether or not evidence gets admitted is you weigh the probative versus the prejudicial value of the evidence. And so there's certain things that, as lay people, we think give you a pretty good indication if someone did something, like, did they do bad things before? And that's specifically the sort of thing that you don't allow in a trial, because you don't want people to be judged for their prior behavior. You want to make sure that the prosecution is proving beyond reasonable doubt that the person did this particular thing at that particular time. And so you can see how her, not just her gender, but also her class kind of colors that interpretation, because the problem with, for example, the poison evidence is not just that it shows intent, which is what the prosecution claims they wanted for, but it just gives an explanation that, you know, is much more palatable to our common, or to the times maybe, cultural assumptions about the way women behave. And so if you think, oh yeah, women would want to kill with poison, And then if you have to kill and you don't have the poison, then you pick up the hatchet or some equivalent. But you wouldn't. So in other words, it's not that she planned the hatchet murder; it's that she planned a poison murder, and then poison being unavailable picked up the hatchet. And all of that is not supposed to factor in, but the judges had to have been aware that sort of thing is floating around in the background.
Does that evidence still exist, like in a museum somewhere, or anything like that, or in the trial?
When you say that evidence,
You know, like the hatchet or the handle, or
well, the Fall River Historical Society has the handleless hatchet, which is thought to be the murder weapon, though it was never conclusively shown to be the murder weapon. There were many axes and hatchets in the Borden house, and the defense lawyer makes great hay out of picking up each one in turn and tossing them aside, declaring them not guilty, because the prosecution never convincingly, sort of beyond a reasonable doubt, picks out the exact weapon. I mean, whether that would be different now, with modern forensics, I don't know. But I would encourage you, actually this is a good weekend for it, to go look at the Lizzie Borden material at the Historical Society. Yes?
With regard to buying the poison, the prussic acid, how come acid was only able to be purchased by prescription from a doctor? What was that purpose from a doctor?
That particular, it was used as an antispasmodic. It had sort of gone out of favor because it was known to be used for killing vermin, and also, unfortunately, for suicides. So that's there's one of the great maneuvers of the defense lawyers are that they are able to keep anyone from testifying that, I'm sorry, just to step back for a minute. Whoever the woman was, there's some doubt about who it was, but whoever the woman was who was identified as Lizzie Borden, who tried to buy the prussic acid, said that she wanted it to put an edge on a sealskin cape. So the question are there innocent uses for prussic acid that have nothing to do with someone wanting to murder someone? And one question would be, one argument would be that people use poisons for household reasons all the time, right? So that meant that the jury might be, inferring something that they shouldn't be inferring from this evidence. And the second is this very specific issue of would you be using it to clean a sealskin cape or not? And the defense managed to keep any furrier or other person to be qualified as an expert to be able to say that wasn't something that they'd ever heard it being used for. It's also strange to think about August being the time that you would want to take out and clean a sealskin cape too. It's a little suspicious. And we know that Lizzie Borden did have them.
She did?
Yeah. It's another tantalizing fact that contributes to the mystery. Yes?
Sorry, question.
Okay.
What part did your sister play in the trial? Second part, after the trial is supposedly over yet, do you have any information? Is that?
Yeah, so the two-part question is, one is what part did Lizzie's sister Emma play at the trial? And the second is it true that they didn't speak afterwards? And so the first thing to say is that she was a totally stalwart supporter. They split the price of their extremely expensive legal team, and Emma was firm that she believed her sister was innocent. She testified at trial very effectively to say that she was the one who suggested that Lizzie burn the dress, rather than it being something that Lizzie had just decided to do on her own, and thus to make it seem like it was a sort of innocent thing to do, as opposed to a very strange thing to do a few days after your father and stepmother are killed. And then they lived together. They used their, one of the supposed motivations for the crime, assuming Lizzie did it, is that they wanted that she wanted a grander kind of life. And so after the trial, they moved to, the equivalent of a McMansion in the Hill District, which, many of you probably have seen on French Street. And they lived together for some time. And then there were, rumors about a handsome coachman, an actress who Lizzie was perhaps a little bit too involved with. But whatever the exact reason was, they became estranged, and then Emma moved out and they never spoke to each other again. But that was sometime after the trial. Yes?
Was there any thought throughout the trial that Lizzie and Bridget may have been
Yeah. So that theory, some people may know of this most recent movie called Lizzie with Chloe Sevigny and Kristen Stewart, and that their solution is that they were basically in it together, which is quite convenient. I mean, it does solve the problem of how Lizzie managed to commit the crimes, or either one of them could have committed them singly and then still not seen the other ones. The prosecution had some suspicion that maybe Bridget was involved, or at least that she knew more than she said. And there were some people who said, "Oh, she started dressing better, afterwards," which suggested maybe that she had been paid off. That's something that Victoria Lincoln talks about in her book, A Private Disgrace. But I'd say that wasn't really a serious consideration. That's a more that's just a desire to solve this kind of practical puzzle. That it's it would solve the practical problems if the two were in it together. Oh yes.
So did John Morse inherit anything, or did he benefit from Andrew Borden's death?
No, basically.
Because they had a business together, so I was wondering if that just fell into his hands, even though it was kind of suffering anyways. Because he was a butcher at one point, so it would make complete sense that he looked like Robbie.
Right, the Morse, the Morse theory, yeah. He's an appealing suspect because he is the suspicious outsider who suddenly just appears the night before the murders, and people at the time thought he was enough of a suspect that the police had to protect him from a mob that followed him around. Because people assumed that he must be the killer because he was a really scruffy kind of outsider with a bad reputation. He was sort of, I think in terms of personality, he was a good fit with his brother-in-law. But I mean, I've never
I'd like
seen
to read this story.
a persuasive argument that he's really. He seems like a precipitant, right? There's something that is happening at that time that triggers the murders, if you assume that somebody in the household did it.
And then the rumor that he was sleeping with the maid Bridget, and so the mother, so Mrs. Borden had made him sleep in the guest room when he usually slept upstairs. So.
Yeah. I think he slept it seemed like sometimes he slept in the guest room and sometimes he slept on the third floor. And I mean, that's an interesting idea as to why, but I mean, I'm not super persuaded by it, I think.
Yeah.
Yes. So, what I find kind of confusing is Lizzie burned her dress, okay, after the fact. Now, to me, that would be evidence that she was guilty of doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's what you call consciousness of guilt, right? In other words, if somebody does something that you wouldn't expect an innocent person to do, or if they, if they do something or don't do something, I mean, it could be an action too. So this was, the prosecution really thought this was damning evidence, but the defense was able to produce the dressmaker who said that the dress actually had been stained with paint. With paint. And
The day
so,
that it was made.
pardon me?
The day that it was made, it was.
Yeah. So, again, it's just a question of why on that particular day would you choose to burn it. And the other thing that always struck me as a little strange is that you would think in a frugal Yankee family they'd have a rag bag. And the defense wanted to introduce evidence that it was the custom of the household to burn old clothes. And that was one of the few evidence arguments that went the other way, that was not favorable to the defense. And Wigmore, again, said that he thought that was a mistake and that might have been grounds for an appeal had she been convicted. Yes?
Bridget was outside washing windows.
Uh,
Right?
Right, at the time of, this is at the time of Mrs. Borden's death.
So she entered the house at some point between the deaths.
Right, so then she came in to wash the windows inside.
Okay, so did you see Lizzie in a dress that had paint? Or, because Lizzie would have had to change and then rechange, if would have had to be more than one dress.
Right. This is the sort of the mystery of the many blue dresses.
Okay.
And it's a sharp point, because one of the things that kind of counted Lizzie Borden's favor is that she is seen by Bridget Sullivan after her mother is killed. Stepmother is killed. Bad. That she's fine, and then in terms of appearance, and then she is seen very quickly by the neighbor, Adelaide Churchill, after the father's death. And again, there's no blood on her person. But the question of she had many blue dresses, and the question of which was the blue dress that she was actually wearing was something that seems to be, suffice it to say, in dispute. It's the different witnesses talk about different backgrounds, different figurations.
It's the blood splat from face, hair,
Right, so
arms, legs.
there's never anything like that seen on her person. So that's part of as a practical matter, it is difficult to imagine how she was able to clean herself so well. Now there is I always leave out something when I'm trying to give the talk efficiently, and the thing that I've left out is the pail in the basement that contained the bloody towels. The police find it, and given that there was a crime committed in the house, they immediately ask about it. Lizzie Borden refers them to her doctor, who says it's okay. I know all about it. The implication being that they're menstrual cloths, and that seems to just be accepted, right? And I think to a modern viewer might wonder about the use to which those cloths had been put. Yes.
Given all the time that you spent, in college and in law school and now doing this book, have you given any thought as to your theories about axe?
My theories about what?
The axe handle, the missing axe.
Oh, the missing axe handle, right. So for those of you, again, I'm assuming that actually most of you know this well, but the reason the handleless hatchet was considered to be the likely murder weapon was the cutting surface, right? So that it seemed to have been something that could have made all the different sized wounds on the bodies, but also because the handle had been broken off, and it seemed like it had been broken off in a way that wasn't, quote unquote, natural. You know, in other words, that the idea that being that the metal part of the hatchet, the blade would be easy to clean, but wood would be difficult to clean. And so that whoever did it, the idea is that that person put it in the basement among other tools and put a little fine ash over it to make it look like it had been there for a while. And then, burned the handle. But as I mentioned earlier, the police, there are police witnesses who contradict the original account of finding that handleless hatchet in the basement, and say that there's one witness in particular he's not the most persuasive to me, but he is a witness who swears that he saw the handle in the box with those other implements. And if you were to believe that, that would mean that the police disposed of it somehow, and that it's unlikely that it was the murder weapon, that it seemed like it was part of a frame-up attempt. One other thing to note is that there are many of these just little odd details that kind of catch you, and one of them is that after the bodies are discovered, the doctor is seen burning something in the kitchen stove. And the defense is very concerned that the implication is that he was burning the handle. And the prosecution say, no, we're not making that argument. But it seemed to be something that was very much on the defense mind, because one of their many arguments, is that if Lizzie Borden had done it, where's the weapon? We know she didn't leave the house, so if you can't produce the weapon, then you can't consider her guilty.
So
Yes.
do you think that the fact that these people, the Bordens, had a considerable amount of money, maybe would have someone in the family, maybe Lizzie, maybe her sister, would have paid the police or paid someone to hide the evidence, to do something with the hand, burn the handle? Do you think that that's a possibility, that this could have happened? I mean, it happens all the time, so why
Right.
not then?
That's I think a more cynical, modern view. That's not an argument that I heard made. It was more there are two schools of thought. One is that there were a number of people, particularly say, as represented by the View and the Fall River Daily Globe, what we would kind of like roughly call the Irish Catholic view, that said, look, if she were a mill hand as opposed to Andrew Borden's daughter, she would have been arrested a long time ago, and this wouldn't be such a big issue. And so thought that the police was unduly favoring someone who was from a prominent family. And then by contrast, Lizzie Borden's supporters, as I mentioned with the defense lawyers, sought to portray the police as these kind of bumbling Keystone cops who were biased against Lizzie Borden and who were also incompetent and just desperate to pin this on someone so they could get a solution.
You had a good defense team.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi. I was wondering what information you had on the theory of Andrew Borden possibly sexually abusing his daughters.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, and it's one that I noticed in the literature doesn't really appear until the early 90s. So I guess what I would say about that is, of course, we don't know, and I suppose you could make the same argument about the uncle too. That there are things about the household that seem very odd, even at the time, that people thought were strange about the relationship between Andrew Borden and Lizzie. A lot of hay is made out of things like the layout of the upstairs, which, as I mentioned, was a converted tenement. So when it was converted, it meant that the rooms open onto each other. So you think, okay, well, there's a dead mother, or there's a relatively powerless stepmother. There's this overly intense but difficult relationship between the father and daughter. There are oddities about Lizzie Borden And so, and also I think to modern viewers or modern people who are looking at this case, they think, oh, well, this is the explanation. I mean, this is how you get such a brutal crime, particularly these wounds that are so located on obliterating the face. I mean, what I would say as someone who looked at this as a legal historian, I would say that it's one of the explanations that tells us more about the time in which the solution, it tell you more about the people who are solving the case than the actual crime. So in other words, I don't think it's a coincidence that it was at that time in the early 90s when suddenly this was a solution that seemed to be available to people, that there were suddenly this interest / awareness that that incest occurs in families. And so then through that lens, through that 90s lens, you look at this case and you think, well, that's the explanation. But many of the things that people point to as evidence are things that would have been equally true of other women in her circumstances, where there was no violence or anything particularly unusual in the family. So, so I really, I can't say whether it happened or not, but I would be cautious about those explanations that I think are driven more by the interpreters' views than the, what it would have looked like to contemporary audience. Yes.
In relation to that, and this is something I have never heard again, years back BCC had a thing where people who had knowledge or people who had stories around this came and spoke and left it so that they would archive them. One man there insisted his grandfather was a police officer at the time, and that there was a tunnel that went underneath the street to Lizzie Borden's apartment, and a doctor had actually performed an abortion, that there was something, he had performed an abortion, and there was a tunnel, so no one knew about this, which I had never heard since, never heard before, but he wrote it as something that he said was passed down to him. And I just wonder if you ever heard that.
No. I've heard a lot, but never that one. It is, there were rumors about Dr. Bowen, who's the doctor who was called to the scene, and there were, some people who thought maybe he was trying to, some people who thought maybe he had a fancy for Lizzie Borden, which doesn't seem very likely to me, but it is sort of gossip. But also that he might have done some things to cover up the crime. And there is that oddity of his being, I just mentioned this with regard to the handle, he spotted burning something by a police officer, and he says, oh, this is just a note from my daughter. And the police officer says that he saw the name Emma on it. And so it does make you, and no will is found, so I mean, it could have been a will, it could have been a letter, it could have been a note, it could have been nothing, it could have been exactly what he said, just some scrap of paper. But some speculated that it might have been paper that had been wrapped around a handle to cover up, bloodstains. But I think that's but this gets it, I think the fascination of the case is that there's so many little intriguing details that make you think that there's something beyond the kind of obvious solution, which is that the right person was tried, and that but that people just couldn't accept that had happened. But it's so, I think that we have a desire to keep it as a mystery and to make it a more complicated story. Yes?
I was just wondering, have you ever seen or heard anything throughout the case that would suggest towards Lizzie being bipolar?
Huh? Yeah, so there needless to say that if you think she did it, there's probably some kind of psychiatric explanation for her behavior, because it's just so extreme. But, you know, there are oddities about her behavior. As I mentioned, there was a desire by the prosecution to do a proper family investigation to see if there had been any insanity in the family. And the consensus seemed to be that, you know, the family tree had a lot of odd apples, but that there was nobody who was necessarily actually insane. But there's discussion of her mother, for example, having these headaches that maybe were an indication of some kind of underlying illness. But I think that as far as an actual diagnosis, the closest I've heard to the bipolar side of it would be, again, Victoria Lincoln's argument that she had some form of epilepsy that led her to commit these murders in some kind of fugue state. And you know, it's a terrific book, and she makes it seem very compelling. I think again, it's because it's harder to just accept the obvious, which is that, you know, there is one person who wanted the people dead, and the method was particularly gruesome. So we look for something that makes it less horrifying. Yes.
I actually had a question. During your research, I think I remember reading that there were some letters from Lizzie found. Is that true?
So I think you may be referring to there are some letters that she sent and also received while she was in jail that are really interesting. You know, to give you a little bit of a picture of what that time in her life was like. But are you talking about the file, or do you mean actual letters?
The actual letters,
yeah.
So they were during her,
right.
her jail time.
There are letters that come up from time to time. The problem is that, of course, we have a limited number of them. But what's so good about the ones that the Historical Society has is that we know that they were to people who were important to her. And so, you know, they give you a little bit of a sense of what she might have been thinking or feeling at the time. With other ones that have popped up, you know, a lot of times they're the sort of thing you make a telephone call about now. And so it's very easy to overread it because there's only one of them, you know, or only 10 of them, say, or 100 of them out of the thousands that she would have sent. So. Yes.
Actually, in my history, my short lifetime, in the early 90s, when it was one of the centennials for Fall River, I worked at a photo lab in Rhode Island, and arrived were two police officers fully clothed with glass negatives for us we were secured in a dark room, and we printed proofs that were given back to the Historical Society that were put in calendars, and I think are still on, probably in print somewhere, but they were nothing compared to the graphicness of what we saw in those glass negatives. It was impressive. We couldn't get him as clear as we wanted to, but you're right about the nature of what he looked like. It was pretty, you could see splatters of blood, and some of the proofs we had, we couldn't print out really well quality for them to run them, but it was pretty impressive to see that those negatives.
Yeah, it's striking to, you know, they do a kind of CSI Fall River. They do the best they can, so that you have these really clear photographs, and then they also took up samples of carpet and pieces of the door frames, etc. So there's actually a fair amount of what we would think of as the kind of evidence that people would look for now, but.
It was pretty cool. You could see, like, in one of the reflections of the upstairs bedroom where the stepmom was murdered, if you now go back and look at the photo, you can see a shadow of the camera in the mirror, that type of an old twin lens. But it was pretty impressive that everything was sealed, and they stood outside the door. It was pretty neat. The manager, the lab was so paranoid, he was counting out sheets of paper with us in the dark of what he was going to allow, because they were, you know, we wanted to respect the fact that none of us were going to carry anything away from that.
Right.
But it was just a neat experience to see that happen.
Yeah. Okay, hello.
Hi.
Congratulations on the book.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you for coming. I just had a question. So a lot of people have written about this trial, and we're all obviously very interested in it. But what was, forgive me if you said this before, I missed the first couple of minutes, but what in your kind of origin story of interest brought you to write this book,
and what did you think was, like unique to you that you could bring forward that maybe other people haven't written about yet?
Yeah, I was interested in the mystery of it. I'd heard of the story, and I'd always been interested in trials. And so I liked the idea of this trial that had not only extensive transcripts and other legal proceedings, but also had all this press coverage. I mean, the short answer is just looking for a senior thesis topic. And I was a student at Harvard, so I wasn't that far away. And so I thought, oh, well, this will be good. And then I just figured that would be it. It's been many years since then. But what's held my attention is the maneuverings of the lawyers, and also my interest in the journalists and the way that they write about the case.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Hi, in the back.
Hi, I was just wondering if anything of epilepsy was involved with her, with Lizzie Borden. If that
Right.
was ever like.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, that's the theory of Victoria Lincoln, who wrote a book called Private Disgrace that you probably know of, which I recommend highly. But other than that, there are many people who look at some of her behavior and say, oh, well, there are various. It's she's epileptic, or she has some other kind of psychological disorder. But I guess the question I'd ask is, like, if you assume she didn't, if you take the murders out of the equation, which I realize is a rather big imaginative leap, and you look at her life, there's nothing that's that remarkable about it that you would think, oh, this is someone who is completely crazy. I mean, she might not be someone you want to invite to tea. She might not have been someone who makes a party go, like a fun person, but she's not someone who you would think that there's some diagnosable any more than anyone else, really. Yes.
Talk about, psychological problems, mental issues, whatever. It seems to me that there was so much hatred. She had so much hatred for her father and, of course, his wife, that she just couldn't help herself. Whether it was for the money, because he had willed, I guess, whatever to his wife's family, whether or not that started her, I just can't figure that out, and no one can, but I just see it as so much hatred that she had for them. Whether
Yeah. Well, that was really the prosecution argument. Oh, okay. Hello.
I just had a question about before. Now, the book itself, is that just about the trials, or is there some kind of investigation going into it?
Well, it covers I think of it as a kind of chronological sweep of the time of the murders all on to through the trial, and then the curious afterlife of the case. So, what's the answer that will get you to buy the book?
Just buy it and find out.
That's a good one.
Wasn't there another hatchet found on a roof?
Yeah, so there is. I mean, as the trial's almost over, there's a hatchet that's found by some boys in a roof that would have been, as some people said, the place that someone who was trying to escape the crime might have thrown on it. I mean, that's another little kind of tantalizing detail, because it's not one. It kind of disappears from view after that. The defense don't bring it in to the trial. There's some newspaper accounts that suggest, oh well, it's probably just a roofer's hammer. I mean, it's a claw.
But she could have thrown it up there too.
Well, she would have had to leave the house, so that doesn't seem very likely. But you don't know. I mean, that's part of the reason that the case is a mystery. Yes.
I was under the assumption, I did some research on her many years ago when I did a paper on her, that she had great love for her father and her father for her as well. And And that was the reason she killed him, because she killed her stepmother. And she knew that she would have been blamed and hated by her father, so she had to kill him too.
Yeah,
That's what I was under the understanding.
so this is the argument that basically that Lizzie Borden wanted to kill her stepmother and then really killed her father because
She didn't want him to disappoint.
she didn't want him to see her as a killer, and that she couldn't handle that idea. And this kind of goes along with what the prosecution argues, that essentially that the only murder that was really planned was the murder of Mrs. Borden.
Right.
And that whether it's because Mr. Borden came home early or because she suddenly realized what she had done when she came down the stairs and thought, oh, father's going to know. And this kind of ties into, yet another thing I realized I left out, which is the mysterious daytime theft at the Borden house about a year before the murders, in which mirrors or anticipates, you might say, some of the details of the murders. Not that it was an important crime, just a few trinkets and horse car tickets and those sorts of things were stolen from Mr. and Mrs. Borden. But it was another example of a crime that didn't seem like it could have been done by an outsider, and it seemed quite clear that Mr. Borden knew who had done it. He said 3 times, "I don't think you'll ever find the person that did this," when after he had summoned the police. And it was at that time, and this of course is famous for those of us who know the mythology of the Borden case, that he began the locking ritual of locking his bedroom door and then putting the key on the mantle, which seems like a pointed statement rather than a precaution against an outsider thieving. So, that's an argument that was considered very persuasive by the prosecution. Right, and she's an interesting figure, the stepmother. I mean, she's the one who seems to be most absent from the stories. That it's very difficult to. I realized as I was writing it that effectively I was reenacting this kind of absence, because she appears as the motivation for the murder, but you don't really get a sense of her as a person. And so I did write a small section about her, just about the way in which she gets used in this story. But she seemed like a pretty mild-mannered person who put up with a lot. To me, she seems like the saddest person in the story. I mean, this is obviously an unhappy story. It's about a double murder, but she seems to be the saddest of all the people of the story. The person for whom I think I probably have the most, empathetic response. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine having to be, and this is an argument that I think is really effective that the prosecution makes, that you imagine you're living with people you just hate that much. He says, and if you have a dispute with someone, you go your way, he goes his. But I mean, to live with each other day after day in this kind of festering way, not speaking of it, this completely exaggerated, kind of perverse version of what we imagine as like Yankee Reserve, where they just freeze each other out. He refers to it as a cancer. He's just unable to think of a term that's harsh enough to explain what it would be like to live under those circumstances and how these things can fester. Yes?
Do you think she could have been protecting someone? And as a woman knowing that she wouldn't be found guilty?
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting argument. I mean, I've run across that a few times as a possible solution. That sort of most famously comes up with this, the Billy Borden story, right? That there's this half illegitimate brother, and it's also suggested by some of the letter writers. It's also one of the things I really enjoyed about researching the case was reading the crank letters, the crank communications, which is what the prosecutor calls them, that come into the chief of police and the prosecutor with all sorts of theories that are very revealing of prejudices at the time, like it's a popish conspiracy, like go arrest the servant, or Or things that were, there people just trying to be helpful, like, do the Bordens have a piano, and if so, have you looked at it? You know, that kind of thing. But it's never, I've never found anything that really suggested that that would be the case, but it, you know, it's an intriguing idea. Yeah. Any last? Okay, well, I think